Some men crumble when they find out their wife is cheating. I'm not some men. My name's Ryan Adams. I'm 52, run my own private investigation agency here in Austin, Texas. Spent my younger years bouncing through foster homes, learning quick that nobody's coming to save you. You survive by your own wits or you don't survive at all. That mindset carried me through a stint in the military, then a career tracking down liars, thieves, and the occasional deadbeat who thought they could outrun responsibility. I don't chase romance. Never had the time or patience for it. Ursula was different, at least, I thought she was. Turns out, I was wrong. It started small. Little things. Ursula's phone face down at dinner, her eyes flicking to it every time it vibrated. Late grocery runs when the fridge was full. The way she'd sigh like she was carrying the weight of the world whenever I asked if she was okay. She never used to be that way. Not before the kids got older. Not before routine turned everything stale. I wasn't home much, sure, but I worked to keep the damn house running. To keep us comfortable. That used to be enough. Then one afternoon, I got a call from an old friend, a cop who owed me a favor. Ryan, he said, voice low, like he didn't want to be the one telling me. You ought to know your wife's been seen around South Congress. Meeting up with some guy at a tattoo shop. I sat with that for a second, looking at my desk, at the half-eaten sandwich I suddenly had no interest in. You get a name? Dylan. 30-something, works at a place called Black Arrow Inc. I thanked him and hung up. Sat there, fingers drumming against the desk. Didn't get mad. Didn't throw things. Just thought about my next move. By evening, I had a plan. I didn't confront Ursula. She'd just lie, spin it into some excuse, make me feel like the bad guy for even asking. No, I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof. And I knew exactly how to get it. The next day, I parked 2 blocks from Black Arrow Inc., blending in with the late afternoon traffic. Watched. Waited. An hour passed before Ursula showed up. She pulled into a side lot, sat there for a moment like she was working up the nerve. Then she got out, smoothed her jeans, adjusted her purse strap, looked in the mirror one last time. That told me everything I needed to know. Women don't check their reflection like that before walking into a tattoo shop unless they're meeting someone they want to impress. Dylan came out to meet her, wiping ink off his hands with a rag, giving her that easy, familiar grin. Tall, lean, covered in tattoos, exactly the type women convince themselves has depth when they're bored with stability. I raised my camera, snapped the first picture as he kissed her cheek, as her shoulders relaxed. More shots as they leaned close, talked in low voices. She laughed at something he said, a real laugh, one I hadn't heard from her in years. I took my proof and left. No need to see more. Back home, Ursula was already in the kitchen when I walked in. She looked up, startled, like I'd caught her doing something wrong even though I hadn't said a word. The guilt was already in her eyes. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice too light, too careful. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, twisted the cap off. "Same as usual." "You." She hesitated. "Busy. Errands, laundry. The usual." Liar. I sipped my beer, watching her over the rim. She was already slipping. She didn't even know it yet. For the next week, I kept things normal. Went to work, handled my cases, came home at the usual time. Let her dig her own hole. Every time she smiled at me across the dinner table, every time she touched my arm like she still meant it, I just nodded along, playing my part. Then I made my first move. A dozen roses. Delivered to the house. A note tucked inside the bouquet. To the new owner. Ursula read it at the counter, confusion knitting her brows. She glanced at me, searching my face. "Did you send these?" I shrugged, taking my coffee to the porch. Must be a mistake. I sat outside, listening to the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of traffic. Inside, I heard her footsteps pacing, heard the rustle of the card as she read it again. That seed of doubt? I'd planted it. Now all I had to do was watch it grow. Ursula didn't mention the flowers again, but I caught her sneaking glances at them like they were ticking down to something. That was the first crack. The next step was to widen it. I kept my schedule the same, up early, coffee black, work, home by 7. But I changed the way I looked at her. Not accusing. Just watching. Letting silence hang longer than it should. Letting her feel the weight of it. A woman like Ursula, who'd built her life around being needed, being wanted, wasn't built for that kind of emptiness. She'd rather face anger, screaming, accusations, at least those things meant I still cared. But I didn't give her that. I let her sit with her own conscience, if she even had one left. By Friday, she was cracking under it. We sat across from each other at dinner, the kids upstairs, the TV humming in the background. She pushed rice around her plate, barely eating. "You've been quiet lately," she said, voice careful, testing. I chewed my food, swallowed. "Haven't had much to say." A pause. Then, "Ryan, if something's wrong, just tell me." I looked at her, really looked, until she dropped her eyes. "I would," I said, finishing my drink, "if I thought you'd be honest back." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I let the moment stretch, watching her fingers grip the fork a little tighter before I stood and rinsed my plate. She didn't follow me. She just sat there, staring at nothing. That night, I set my next move in place. A little deeper cut, something to make her sweat. I opened her laptop, logged into our shared cloud storage, and dragged a single photo into a folder she'd find. A picture of her and Dylan outside the tattoo shop, him leaning in, her smiling up at him. Nothing blatant, but enough. A landmine set under thin ice. Then I closed the laptop and went to bed. I didn't have to wait long. Next afternoon, while I was outside cleaning my truck, she was inside, handling bills like she always did. 10 minutes later, the door creaked open behind me. "Ryan," she said, too steady, like she'd rehearsed it. I turned, wiping my hands on a rag. "Yeah." She hesitated. "Did you put something in the cloud drive?" "Like what?" She was holding herself too still, her fingers twitching at her sides. "There's a picture in there. I don't know how it got there." I let my face stay blank, unreadable. "Must have been a glitch." "A glitch?" she echoed, voice thin. "Yeah. You know how these things are. Maybe the computer pulled it from your phone." I tossed the rag onto the truck bed, watching her without watching her. "Anything in there I should be worried about?" That landed. She blinked, swallowed. "No," she said, too quick. "Nothing." I nodded slow. "Good." I turned back to the truck, dismissing her. Letting her stand there, feeling the walls closing in. The thing about guilt, it's like a wounded animal. It gets unpredictable when it's cornered. And Ursula was damn near out of places to hide. That night, she barely slept. I felt her tossing, turning, shifting under the covers. The next morning, she left early, saying she had errands. I didn't bother asking what. She went to see him. I knew before I even tailed her. Same parking lot, same routine. Only this time, there was a difference. Dylan wasn't all smiles today. He was tense, standing stiff as she talked, her hands moving, desperate. She was unraveling in front of him, and he didn't like it. I watched from across the street, coffee in hand, sunglasses low on my nose. Ursula reached for him, but he pulled back, rubbing a hand over his mouth like he was trying to figure out how the hell he got here. I almost laughed. See, guys like Dylan, they love the idea of being the escape. The fantasy. The one she sneaks off to when she wants to forget about grocery lists and mortgage payments. But the second that fantasy turns into real-life consequences, they run. I watched her slump, defeated. He said something, short, final. Then he walked back inside, leaving her standing there in the midday sun, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I waited until she drove off before I made my next move. Inside the shop, the kid at the front, piercings, bleached hair, barely glanced up as I walked in. "Need something?" he asked, flipping through a magazine. "Yeah," I said, resting my hands on the counter. "Looking for Dylan." He eyed me, taking in the old boots, the worn jacket, the sharpness in my face. "He's in the back. You got an appointment?" I smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. Something like that. Dylan was hunched over a sketchbook when I stepped through the back curtain. He looked up, frowning, then recognition hit. I saw it clear as day the moment he knew exactly who I was. "Hey," he started, standing, palms up like he was already trying to defuse something. "Look, man." I cut him off with a slow shake of my head. "Don't insult me by pretending you didn't know who she belonged to." He flinched at that. "Good." I took a step closer, letting him feel the weight of the air between us. "You think you're something special, kid? Think you got one over on me?" I chuckled, low and slow. "You're a goddamn intermission. A break in the routine before she goes back to real life. And now that she's falling apart, you want out. That's fine. You were never going to be man enough to stand in front of me anyway." His jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. "Do yourself a favor," I said, leaning in just enough that he could smell the coffee and cigarette smoke on my breath. "Find a new playground. Because if I see your name anywhere near my wife again, you won't like how I handle it." His throat bobbed. "Yeah, got it." I let the silence stretch, then gave him one last look before turning on my heel and walking out. Outside, the sun was setting, long shadows stretching across the pavement. Ursula was still nowhere to be seen. Probably parked somewhere, hands on the wheel, trying to figure out what the hell she was going to do now. Didn't matter, because I'd already decided exactly how this was going to end. Ursula came home late that night. I was in the garage, working on an old carburetor, the radio playing low. I heard her car pull in, heard the hesitation before she shut off the engine. She knew, or maybe she just had a feeling. Either way, she was walking into a house that wasn't hers anymore, not really. She stepped into the doorway, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. "Hey," she said. I didn't look up. "Hey." A beat of silence. "Then you eat?" I wiped grease off my hands, set down the wrench. "Yeah." She lingered, like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out how. I let the moment stretch, let her sit in it. Then I turned, met her eyes, and watched her flinch. Guilt was an ugly thing when it sat on someone's face long enough. "You look tired," I said. Her throat bobbed. "Just a long day." "That right?" She swallowed. Ryan, I let out a slow breath, cutting her off without saying a word. Then I reached over to the workbench, grabbed a small white box, and tossed it onto the table between us. A pregnancy test. Still in the wrapper. Her face went pale. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. I leaned back against the workbench, crossing my arms. "Figured you might want to check. Just in case." "Jesus Christ." She ran a hand through her hair, stepping back like the damn thing might bite her. "Why would you?" "Because you're sloppy, Ursula." I let the words settle. "You're careful, but not careful enough. You erase messages, you clear your call logs, but you don't think about the things that stick, like the receipts in your purse, the timestamps on your credit card, the way your scent changes when you come home late, like cheap cologne and bad decisions." She shook her head, lips pressed tight. "You're wrong." I studied her for a long moment. "Then take the test." Her breath hitched. She didn't reach for it. I exhaled, slow and steady. "Figured." She gripped the edge of the doorway like she needed something to hold her up. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, straightened her spine. "I never meant for this to happen." I nodded, like I was agreeing. "Yeah, no one ever does." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. She looked down, rubbing her arms like she could shake off the weight of it. I could feel it coming. The excuses, the explanations, the inevitable bargaining. But I wasn't interested. Not in the reasons, not in the regret. I'd already made my decision. This wasn't about salvaging anything. It was about control. "Pack a bag," I said, turning back to the carburetor. She blinked. "What?" "You heard me." Her breath hitched, panic creeping in now. "Ryan, please. Let's just." "No." I set the wrench down a little harder than necessary, finally looking at her. "I'm not playing that game, Ursula. Not doing the part where you cry, I get mad, and we go in circles until I cave. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She took a step forward, then stopped, her fingers curling into fists. "You're serious?" I nodded once. "Dead serious." She sucked in a sharp breath, but she didn't argue. Because she knew she'd lost. Knew I wasn't the kind of man to beg, to plead, to give second chances. Whatever fantasy she'd been living in, it ended right here, in the garage, with the smell of motor oil and burnt-out love hanging between us. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, voice small. "Not my problem." She let out a shaky laugh, one that had no humor in it. "Jesus, Ryan." I just watched her, let her sit in it. Her shoulders slumped, and I saw it, the shift. The moment she understood this wasn't something she could fix with words. She turned without another word and walked back inside. I let her go. I stayed in the garage for a while, finishing what I'd started. By the time I went in, the bedroom door was shut, light off underneath. I didn't check on her. Didn't ask if she was okay. Because I wasn't that man anymore. The one who cared. The one who gave a damn. And I never would be again. She was gone by morning. No goodbye, no note. Just an empty space in the closet where her clothes used to be and a few drawers left half open like she'd been in a hurry. I stood there for a second, taking it in, then grabbed a shirt from the dresser and pulled it over my head. Downstairs, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that settles deep, like a place that knows it's been abandoned. I poured coffee, black and scalding, and stood by the window, watching the sun rise over the backyard. She'd be at her sister's place. Scarlett was the only person she had left. Ursula's parents were old school, the kind that believed in family values and keeping vows. Once they found out, they wouldn't be much help. And they would find out. That part was coming. The phone rang. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, Another call. Same number. I sighed, grabbed it off the counter. Yeah. Jesus, Ryan. Scarlett's voice was tense, like she'd been up all night. What the hell did you do to her? I took a sip of coffee. Didn't do a damn thing. She's a mess. She won't stop crying. Should have thought about that before she spread her legs for another man. A sharp inhale on the other end. You're cold. Not cold, I said, setting the mug down. Just done. She didn't say anything right away. Probably trying to find the right words, the ones that would make me change my mind. Like she thought I hadn't already lived this moment 100 times in my head. Finally, she sighed. She wants to come back, she said, hesitant. Wants to talk. Not happening. Ryan. She made her bed, Scarlett. Let her lie in it. Silence. Then, softer, she's scared. Good. I didn't say that out loud, but I didn't offer any comfort, either. I wasn't in the business of making things easier for people who'd stab me in the back. She thinks you're gonna ruin her, Scarlett went on. She's afraid of what you'll do. She should be. A long pause. Are you? I smiled, but there was no humor in it. What do you think? Scarlett exhaled, long and slow. Ryan, please. Don't destroy her. I let that hang for a second, then chuckled. You think I need to? I leaned against the counter, stretching my legs out. She did that all on her own. Another pause, heavier this time. I don't know who you are anymore. Guess that makes two of us. I hung up. Outside, the world was waking up. Cars starting, dogs barking, neighbors heading off to work. Normal life carrying on, unaffected. That was the thing about betrayal. It felt like the world should stop, like everyone should pause and acknowledge the wreckage. But they don't. They just keep going. And so do you. I went about my day like nothing had happened. Work, a couple of cases, lunch at a diner off I-35 where the coffee was terrible, but the waitress never asked questions. I ran into Margaret on my way back. Old school, sharp-eyed, watching the world from her porch like she always did. Heard Ursula left, she said, folding her hands over her book. Yep. She nodded, like that confirmed something for her. You all right? Better than she is. A small smirk. That bad? Worse. She hummed, flipping a page. Figured you'd handle it that way. I glanced at her. What way is that? Like a man who's already won. I didn't respond to that. Didn't need to. She was right. That night, I had a bottle of bourbon and no plans, but then my phone buzzed. Not a number I recognized, but I had a feeling. I answered. There was a pause. A breath. Then Dylan's voice, tight and controlled. We need to talk. I grinned slow. That's so. I don't want any trouble, man. Then you should have stayed in your lane. Silence. A shift on the other end, like he was pacing. She's out of my life. I told her not to contact me. I swirled the bourbon in my glass, watching the ice melt. Smart. But I need to know. He hesitated. Are we good? I let the question sit, enjoying the way it must have burned in his throat to ask. Let me put it this way, I said finally. You stay away, keep your mouth shut, and never so much as think about my wife again. Then yeah, we're good. Another pause. Then, quietly, understood. I hung up. It was funny. They always thought they were getting away with something, right up until they realized they never were. The fallout started slow. First, whispers. Then, silence. The kind that stretches between old friends when they don't know whose side they're supposed to be on. I didn't lose sleep over it. People pick their battles, and this wasn't mine to fight. It was Ursula's. A week passed. Then two. I didn't hear from her. Didn't expect to. She was licking her wounds, trying to figure out how to stitch together the life she'd just ripped apart. Scarlett called a few times, left messages I didn't bother returning. Nothing left to say. She'd chosen her side. Then, one afternoon, I got a text from Ursula's mother. Short. Direct. We need to talk. I stared at it for a minute, then replied. My office. 3 p.m. Don't be late. She showed up 10 minutes early. A woman raised on discipline, the kind that believed in showing up sharp and leaving an impression. I let her sit in the waiting area for a few minutes before calling her in. Power play. Subtle, but effective. She walked in stiff-backed, sharp gray slacks, beige blouse, a purse clutched in her lap, like she was holding herself together. Her face was tight, composed, but her fingers twitched against the leather. Ryan, she said. Mrs. Diaz. I leaned back in my chair, lacing my fingers together. To what do I owe the pleasure? Her jaw tensed. I think we both know. I waited. She sighed, adjusting the strap of her purse. Ursula is struggling. I raised an eyebrow, and she hesitated, like she was waiting for some flicker of sympathy that wasn't coming. And I want to know what you're planning to do. I let out a slow breath, tapping my fingers against the desk. Funny. That almost sounds like you think this is my problem. She's still your wife. No, she's not. A flicker of something behind her eyes. Disapproval, maybe. She shifted in her seat, smoothing out invisible wrinkles on her blouse. Ryan, I'm not here to argue. I'm here because my daughter, your wife, is falling apart. She's lost everything. Her home, her friends, her stability. She made a mistake. Yes, but a mistake. I leaned forward. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is backing into a mailbox. What she did, that was a choice. She inhaled sharply, but I didn't let her speak. You want to help her? Fine. That's your call. But don't sit here and act like I owe her something. I don't. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, she's staying with Scarlett. I nodded, unsurprised. She's not doing well, she continued. Won't leave the house, won't eat. She won't even talk to me. She paused, then carefully, she keeps saying you're going to ruin her. I smiled, slow and sharp. I don't have to. She's doing that just fine on her own. A flicker of unease crossed her face. She straightened, gathering herself, pressing her lips into a thin line. You're a good man, Ryan. You always were. I didn't answer. She stood, adjusting her purse strap. I just hope you remember that. I watched her leave, footsteps sharp against the tile. When the door shut behind her, I exhaled, long and slow. She thought she was warning me. Thought she was reminding me of the man I used to be. The thing was, that man was dead. Ursula buried him the second she walked into another man's arms. And I had no interest in bringing him back. By the end of the month, everyone knew. I didn't need to spread it. These things had a way of traveling fast, especially in a town where people had too much time and not enough sense to mind their own business. Ursula wasn't just a woman who cheated. She was a woman who got caught. That was the part people wouldn't forgive. I started seeing it in small ways. The way neighbors looked at me a second longer when I passed. The way conversation stopped just a little too suddenly when I walked into a room. The bartender at Murphy's setting my drink down with a quiet nod. No small talk, no forced sympathy. People respected a man who handled his business without making a scene. I was finishing up a case one afternoon when Margaret caught me on my way in. She was perched on her porch swing, book in her lap, same as always. But her eyes tracked me different this time. Heard Ursula's been having a rough go of it, she said, casual. I glanced up at her. That right? She nodded, flipping a page she wasn't reading. Scarlett stopped by earlier. Said she's thinking of moving. I snorted, unlocking the front door. That's supposed to be my problem? Margaret shrugged. Just seems a shame. All that for a man who never even stuck around. I paused, hand on the doorknob. Looked at her. You keeping tabs on me now, Margaret? She smirked, the kind that said she wasn't about to apologize for knowing everything before everyone else did. I don't have to. People talk. People always do. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. Doesn't change a damn thing. Didn't matter where Ursula went. Didn't matter if she packed up and left the state or if she spent the next 10 years trying to outrun the mess she made. There was no fixing it. No putting things back where they belonged. Some things, when they break, you don't try to glue back together. You just sweep up the pieces and move on. The divorce went quick. I made sure of that. Ursula didn't fight it, didn't ask for anything, didn't even try to argue. She just signed the papers, hands shaking like she already knew this was the final nail in the coffin of whatever life she thought she could salvage. A week after it was finalized, I went down to the shop and had Dylan's name scratched off the lease. A little favor from the building owner, who never liked him much to begin with. Bad for business, he said, shaking his head as he filed the paperwork. Never trust a man who thinks he can take something that ain't his. I nodded, pocketing the receipt. Smart man. By the time I left, Dylan was already packing up. He didn't look at me as I passed, didn't say a word. Just kept his head down, shoving supplies into a duffel bag like he was racing against a clock only he could hear. Smart move, I told him, pausing by the door. Starting fresh somewhere else. His hands clenched around the bag straps. Yeah, he muttered. I smiled, slow and steady. Make sure it's far. He swallowed hard, nodded. I walked out. The last time I saw Ursula was in a parking lot outside a grocery store. She was sitting in the driver's seat of her car, staring at the wheel like she didn't know where she was supposed to go next. She looked up, caught my eye through the windshield. For a second, I thought she might wave. Might try to say something. She didn't. She just put the car in reverse, pulled out, and drove away. I watched her taillights fade, then turned back toward my truck. There was nothing left to say. Nothing I needed to hear. Some men fall apart when their wife cheats. Some let it ruin them, let it turn them into something bitter and hollow. Me? I was just getting started. A month later, I sat at Murphy's, nursing a bourbon, watching the game on the old TV behind the bar. The place was half full, the usual crowd, blue-collar guys winding down, old-timers who'd been coming here longer than I'd been alive. Nobody asked questions. Nobody offered pity. That was the thing about men like us. We didn't need to say much. A nod, a clap on the back, that was enough. Murphy slid another glass in front of me, wiping the counter with his rag. Heard it's official. Yeah, I said, taking a slow sip. It's done. He grunted. Messy. I shook my head. Clean as it gets. He nodded, like that was the right answer. Good. Across the bar, a group of guys were talking low, one of them laughing under his breath. I caught Dylan's name in the middle of it. Didn't react, just listened. He's gone, huh? One of them said, shaking his head. Took off in the middle of the night. Heard he left half his shit behind. Heard he got fired, too, another added. Word got around about what he did. No shop in town would take him. Murphy snorted. Guy thought he could snake another man's wife and come out clean? Dumbass deserved worse. I smirked, swirling the bourbon in my glass. Ursula? She was a ghost now. Moved out of Scarlett's, some apartment on the other side of town where no one knew her name. I'd seen her once, at a red light, sitting in a beat-up sedan that wasn't ours. She looked tired. Older. Like life had chewed her up and spit her out. She didn't look my way. Just gripped the wheel like she was waiting for the damn light to let her go. It did. And so did I. Margaret caught me outside my place a few days later, leaning on her cane, watching the street like she was looking for something she'd never find. Heard the divorce is final, she said, not a question. Yep. She gave a slow nod. You did it clean. Only way to do it. She studied me for a long moment. Regret anything? I thought about that. Thought about the nights I'd spent awake, playing it all over in my head, wondering if there was another way it could have gone. Thought about the moment I realized I didn't love her anymore. Not the way I used to. No, I said finally. Not a damn thing. She smirked. Good. She turned, headed back to her porch, and I watched her go, tipping my hat. That night, I sat on my back porch, whiskey in one hand, cigar in the other, watching the sky turn dark. There was a time when I thought I'd spend my last days with Ursula, growing old, watching the kids move out, settling into something easy. But easy wasn't real. Not for men like me. I took a slow drag, exhaled into the night. Some men let betrayal break them. Some let it turn them bitter, leave them hollow. Me? I let it sharpen me. And that was the difference.